Over the many years of human expansion, few civilizations rival the US and Russia in size and power. Such power has the potential to tear apart countries in a few years, or an entire planet in a few minutes. It's no wonder why tension between the US and the USSR rose to its peak during the Cold War after the introduction of the nuclear bomb. Nothing like the nuclear bomb has ever been seen prior to the United States' victory over Japan in World War II. After seeing the results of the bomb, Stalin decided to focus more on creating weapons of mass destruction for himself. Now that the US and the USSR are armed with such devastating weapons, life as it was known before would never be the same.
The U.S. has been growing in power and size ever since the Declaration of Independence was signed. It wasn't until the end of the Second World War that the U.S. was considered as one of the world's most powerful countries. World War II brought the U.S. a prosperous industry and a good economy, giving Americans a comfortable living space. The ending of World War II was a big relief for everyone around the world, and even though the World War ended, the fight wasn't over. The Cold War came shortly after the Big World War. The Cold War was a very tense moment for the United States and the USSR.
Soviet Russia was a country of hard work and little resolve. After the Russian Revolution and Civil War, which together lasted almost 10 years, Vladimir Lenin, the new leader of Russia, had finally succeeded in creating a communist country. Keeping in mind that it was the first of its kind, the communist government proved to be frail. Soviet Russia was powerful in its own right, however, mostly due to its grand military power and relentless industrial speed and capabilities. The US saw Russia's military and economic power as a threat, thrusting the two superpowers into a conflict of technology and mutual fear. This conflict was the Cold War. The Cold War, a time of developmental competition and great advancements from both the US and the USSR. But there was more to the Cold War than just advancements in knowledge and space travel. On both sides, new and destructive weapons are crafted, and the tensions are rising. On multiple occasions, the two superpowers threaten to annihilate each other, and subsequently, the entire planet. The US grasped for allies and to help defeat communism, while Russia looks for allies to defend it.
Even though the Cuban Revolution didn't officially start until July 26, 1953, the problem started in 1952 when Fulgencio Batista seized power during the wholly contested election. Batista had already been president for a long time now, from 1940 to 1944, and decided to run again for presidency in 1952. When it was found out that Batista was going to lose, he quickly seized power before the election was cancelled. Many people weren't happy in how Batista just grabbed power all of a sudden like that, so a rising political star, Fidel Castro, began the downfall of Batista as soon as the elections were cancelled. On the morning of July 26, 1953, Fidel Castro made his first move. Castro knew that for a revolution he needed weapons, so his first target was the isolated Moncada barricade. 138 men attacked the barricades. Castro was hoping the element of surprise would have helped the men, but it didn't. From the start, the plan was a fiasco. In just a few hours, the attack had stopped and ended with many men captured and most of them killed. Only 19 federal soldiers were killed. Fidel Castro and Raul Castro escaped but were later captured as well. Fidel Castro, Raul Castro, and the rest of the surviving men were put in public trial. But Castro, being the trained lawyer he is, quickly switched the trial onto Batista in his second half of power. The Castro brothers were given a sentence of 15 years. On May 1955, the Batista government released many political prisoners, which included Raul and Fidel Castro. Raul and Fidel Castro decided to regroup in Mexico. Once in Mexico, the Castro brothers started their movement once again. Castro's movement gained power more and more by having rebels join his cause. Batista decided to send a large portion of his army to get rid of Castro once and for all. But this attack backfired on Batista, having his soldiers either switch sides or deserting the army. Castro ended up pushing all the way up to Batista, but Batista had left the country knowing he wasn't going to be able to beat Castro. Castro ended up with the power and support of the Cuban people.
The Cuban Missile Crisis began in October 1962 when Soviet Russia had armed Cuba with deadly missiles for its self-defense. Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of the USSR at the time, decided not to make the US aware of this armament, which was the first potentially fatal mistake. It was in 1960 that the arming of Cuba had started, and it was 2 years later, in 1962, when the US finally found out Russia's big secret. The missiles in Cuba could reach most major cities in the eastern states of America, which is most likely why the US wasn't going to take this threat lightly. The US blockaded Cuba on October 22nd, threatening to attack all who opposed the blockade and to take their weapons. The tensions rose between the two countries. Soviet Russia gave the missiles to Cuba for defense, but the US saw it as a direct threat. It wasn't until the Cuban Missile Crisis started that John F. Kennedy realized that the US had missiles in Turkey and Italy, saying, "It was as if we suddenly began to put a major number of MRBMs in Turkey. Now that's gotta be goddamn dangerous, I would think." To end the conflict, the US agreed to compromise by taking their missiles out of Turkey and Italy. Russia then took their missiles out of Cuba, creating a mutually beneficial environment.
During the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy and Khrushchev were quite vocal about their opinions and thoughts. They would send each other letters about how they could end this conflict calmly, without either side shooting a nuclear missile at the other. These letters were sent with ideas and conditions each side wanted. While these letters were being sent, the tension between the United States and Soviet Russia were high. In the end of all of these letters, Kennedy and Khrushchev came to a conclusion in what to do about the missiles in Cuba and Turkey.
After all of the letters, the Kennedys finally decided that in order to put an end to this crisis, they would have to take the US missiles out of Turkey, which was in range of most major Russian cities. In doing this, they would end the conflict. Kennedy sent a letter to Khrushchev saying that the US would take their missiles out of Turkey and that it was their original intent. Khrushchev was glad when he found out that the United States took their missiles out of Turkey, because both sides ended up taking their missiles out of their respective countries.
Had it not been for the communication of the Kennedy brothers and the Soviet negotiators, the world as we know it today would have not been the same. Both countries were able to compromise in a way that was mutually beneficial to both sides.
You've got a friend in me. You've got a friend in me. When the road looks rough ahead and you're miles and miles from your nice warm